An English town is plagued by a series of mysterious heart attacks. Something is killing its residents, one by one.
It shocked me to the core. 1 minute, she was in bed, and in the next minute, she's dead.
Their hearts simply stop beating. Doctors can't understand why.
That was the unthinkable. I felt something was wrong.
What or who was killing people in this quiet English town? In the quaint mill town of Hyde, England, Irene Turner had come down with a cold. Irene's husband died a few years earlier, and now she lives alone. A neighbor, Michael Woodruff, periodically checks in on her.
She hadn't been feeling very well, so she phoned for the doctor to visit her, and he said he would visit later on that day.
Irene disliked doctor's offices, so Dr. Shipman usually came to her. One of his fellow doctors, Jeremy Dirks of Brooks Surgery, knew of Dr. Shipman's strong bedside manner with his patients.
Dr. Shipman was very much the old school type. He liked to deal with the patient from the cradle to the grave, patients who maybe with another doctor may have been admitted to hospital, he would care for at home. If somebody rang with a chest pain, nowadays we will call 999 and get an ambulance, get a paramedic crew. He would go out to see them.
Dr. Shipman decides to send her to the hospital and tells her to lie down until the ambulance arrives. Since Michael Woodruff is out for lunch, the doctor asks another neighbor if she will wait with Irene. Dr. Shipman can't stay, as another patient needs his immediate attention. Shipman looks in on his patient one more time before leaving. When the neighbor arrives, she finds Irene lying on the bed, and it looks like she isn't breathing. She won't wake up. Her neighbor immediately calls Dr. Shipman, then tries to find Michael Woodruff. Dr. Shipman rushes back to Irene's home, and the neighbor finally locates Michael Woodruff.
I got a phone call from a lady that lived opposite to Irene and said, "Mike, I'm at Irene's with Dr. Shipman. He thinks she's dead." I immediately came down. The neighbour was still there, and so was Shipman.
Dr. Shipman's initial diagnosis is heart failure, brought on by advanced diabetes. But Irene Turner's family was not aware she had heart problems.
It shocked me to the core. 1 minute, she was in bed. I'd brought her some pastry for her dinner, and she was fine. And in the next minute, she's dead.
It was very sudden and upsetting. Just absolute shock. It wasn't something that was expected because she was so fit. I'd spoken to her the day before.
It seemed as if Irene simply had the common cold. Her death perplexes her family. Several days later, at the doctor's office, Anna Spencer waits with a friend. Anna has been complaining of an upset stomach and pain in her back, but is otherwise in seemingly good health.
I need you now.
But just minutes after she walks into the exam room, Anna Spencer's heart suddenly stops beating. Dr. Harold Shipman and his nurse work frantically to save Anna, but she is in full cardiac arrest. This is the second mysterious heart failure the same doctor has seen in as many days. There is nothing that can be done to save her. Anna Spencer has passed away. Dr. Shipman must notify Anna's friend of the news. Although Anna's records showed a long history of heart disease, her friends and family had no idea she was ill. Dr. Harold Shipman had been practicing medicine for nearly 20 years and knew everyone in Hyde. How could Anna have died so suddenly? Was her death really related to heart disease? Something didn't add up. Before her death, Anna had decided that she would like to be cremated, a common choice in Britain.
There is a legal requirement in Britain, in the UK, for 2 doctors to co-sign a cremation form before a body may be cremated and disposed of.
Dr. Shipman gives the forms to Dr. Raj Patel of the nearby Brook Surgery.
Dr. Shipman gave the diagnosis of coronary heart disease.
The doctors review Anna's medical records, searching for what could have triggered the death.
The sort of arteries are just like a time bomb waiting to go off, really. Wouldn't surprise me at all that somebody with that kind of medical history would suddenly die from a heart attack.
Anna was ill, but not deathly ill, and hers was yet another unexpected death of a patient under Dr. Shipman's care. Was something targeting Dr. Shipman's patients? While the doctors hadn't found any reason to be alarmed, someone else in the town was becoming suspicious. According to Hyde taxi driver John Shaw, something just wasn't right. There had to be an explanation.
There were so many of them. Ladies that I'd had in the car only days before they died.
Anna Spencer and Irene Turner were both regular customers of Shaw, and the news of the deaths came as a shock. The deaths continue as Shaw loses yet another one of his customers from an apparent heart attack.
I'd built up a considerable clientele of ladies in Hyde, and one day I was told not to pick a particular lady up because she'd passed away.
Shaw didn't think these women were the first. Several others had also died unexpectedly.
Although they weren't 100% fit, there were none of them, in my opinion, that were on death's door.
Why were Shaw's clients being targeted? And by what? And possibly by whom?
I couldn't explain to myself why all these ladies had all died in very similar circumstances.
Each death taken alone can be explained. Heart attacks do kill without warning. But Shaw is the only person in town who sees the whole group.
After 5 or 6 ladies had died, I started to keep a list of names, addresses, and approximate dates of the deaths.
Was an epidemic or plague killing the residents of Hyde? Something quiet and unseen. Could it be that someone with a grudge against Dr. Shipman or John Shaw wanted revenge? Whatever it was, the silent killer was lurking somewhere in the small town, ready to strike again. After a string of sudden deaths in Hyde, England, a local taxi driver fears something is mysteriously killing his clients one by one.
I knew them all, and I knew that before they died, only in some cases, a matter of days before they died, I'd had them in the car, and they were fit and well.
Shaw is afraid, but does not know what to do besides keep a list of each strange and suspicious death. In another part of Hyde, Dr. Harold Shipman looks over his case files of yet another unexpected patient death, James Davidson. Dr. Shipman goes to Dr. Jeremy Dirks to review the death and to sign the necessary cremation paperwork.
It was not an unexpected course of events, particularly when I was given a detailed account of the last few days, months of his medical history.
Shipman explains to Dirks that he had seen James earlier that day and that the patient had long-term circulation problems, especially in his legs. James's brother, Frank, waited in the kitchen during the examination. Dr. Shipman said he quickly realized James was in trouble and needed to go to the hospital immediately because he had an irregular heartbeat.
He had a long documented history by Dr. Shipman of heart failure and respiratory problems, and he was the sort of patient who could suddenly develop acute heart failure.
Frank, James is taken.
Shipman went to tell James's brother to call an ambulance.
To the hospital? Yes.
But by the time they got back to the living room, James was sitting in his chair, motionless. It had only been a few minutes, but a few minutes too long. James Davidson's heart had stopped.
Most of the causes of the deaths of Dr. Shipman's patients tended to be sudden deaths or fairly quick deaths, usually involving heart failure, heart attacks, or strokes.
Based on the medical histories, the deaths seemed normal. But still, there seemed to be something strange. What was happening? Dr. Shipman and John Shaw are the only ones aware of the rising number of deaths. That is, until Reverend Dennis Marr begins to notice his church members missing from Sunday Mass.
I was settling into the parish and getting to know people. It was beginning to become noticeable, the number of people who died suddenly. People who would be here in the church on a Sunday, and the following day I'd be told that they were found dead in the house.
Is there a hidden illness yet to be identified? Or is it something more sinister?
These people were normally people you would not expect to die suddenly. They hadn't said they weren't well, or they hadn't any particular illness that would lead one to believe that they would just drop dead.
Yet they did. One after another, their hearts just stopped. Despite the doctor's best efforts, something or someone was preying on the people of Hyde, and it seemed to be affecting Dr. Shipman's patients, Reverend Marr's church members, and John Shaw's customers. What was the link? Only 4 months after James Davidson died in the home he shared with his brother Frank, a handyman came by the house to finish some repair work. Frank Davidson had passed away. A second terrible shock to the family. News of the Davidson brothers' deaths soon reaches taxi driver John Shaw.
My neighbour told me that the brothers had died very close together.
As more of his taxi customers die, Shaw realizes a disturbing pattern. He has driven them all to the same doctor.
I got to the stage where when someone told me of a death, I was immediately saying, "Who's the doctor?" And it was always the same answer.
John Shaw realizes all of the patients are under Dr. Shipman's care. Is something wrong with the doctor? Is he misdiagnosing his patients?
My brain was telling me that I was at fault. I was going crackers to even consider that a very well-respected doctor in Hyde, the best doctor in Hyde, supposedly, was killing his patients. It was ridiculous.
When Dr. Dirks learns the second Davidson brother has died of a heart attack, he finds it odd.
It's obviously something that strikes you as unusual, particularly when two members of one family die close together.
And again, there is a record of heart problems.
Such a death certainly didn't evoke any anxiety on my part. It all seemed absolutely normal.
The doctors search for some trigger for the mysterious heart attacks. The cause might be a simple one.
Deep breath.
There's always, that time of year, some sort of flu viral type infections going around, you know, but it's always bad at the early part of the year and through the winter. Death rates do rise due to respiratory problems in the winter.
We deal with death on a daily basis. The patients were almost always people who appeared to have had a period of considerable ill health before they died.
But they would soon find out that the deaths were anything but normal. Doctors Dirks and Patel do not realize it, but a cloaked killer is still on the prowl. In Hyde, England, a string of sudden deaths raises some residents' suspicions.
It wasn't like, for example, that there was a plane crash, and so suddenly there would be a block of people gone. It was drip, 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 and that was the way these people were dying.
As more and more people are buried, the local undertaker begins to notice a terrifying pattern. In March of 1998, a doctor from the Brooks Surgery is at the mortuary to countersign another cremation form. One of the funeral directors mentions a concern they have about the deaths.
Dr. Booth, do you mind if I have a word?
There is something extremely puzzling about the way the bodies were found.
Another observation made by the funeral directors was that the bodies were all found in a very similar manner. They were fully dressed and often sat comfortably, either in a chair or an armchair.
See what he says.
Something didn't seem right. Heart attack victims are usually found on the floor, appearing distressed, perhaps struggling to get to a phone. The bodies had all been found with no sign of trauma. That meant the deaths weren't natural, a startling find. Patients weren't falling because of a mysterious and sudden illness. They were being killed by a person. The funeral directors notice something even more unsettling.
All of the deaths that we were co-signing cremation forms for were all of Dr. Shipman's.
The doctors at Brooks Surgery start to recall earlier conversations.
It was just the casual remark made between us, perhaps at a regular meeting, where one of us might say, you know, forgive me for being late, I've had to sign a cremation form for Dr. Shipman rather urgently. And that might trigger a remark from another doctor, which would be, well, that's a coincidence. I did a form for Dr. Shipman myself.
Now it is not only John Shaw and the Brooks surgery doctors talking about Dr. Shipman.
I was aware that on my visitations around the parish and when I would be out there among the people, how often Dr. Shipman was mentioned. First of all, about how wonderful he was and how caring he was, but also the other aspect of that was people would often say in a jocose way, we sometimes call him Dr. Death because so many of his patients seemed to die suddenly.
Even though there is now considerable speculation that Dr. Shipman is somehow behind the deaths, Shaw, Maher, and the doctors have absolutely no proof. In his gut, taxi driver John Shaw knows something terrible is happening.
Had it been just the odd one, I wouldn't have ever suspected.
But there are so many. Shaw fears there might be something dangerous about Dr. Harold Shipman's practice. Is Dr. Shipman losing his ability to treat his patients? Is he prescribing the wrong drugs and unintentionally killing his patients?
The first time I spoke to my wife about it, she was shocked, she was frightened, and she said, if you're wrong about this, she said, you could get in very serious trouble. She said, don't go to the police about this. She said, they'll just ridicule you.
He starts to voice his concerns to his passengers.
I went to the stage of actually telling one lady, one widow, not to go to visit Shipman on her own. And she immediately stopped using me as a taxi because she felt that I was paranoid.
It would be inconceivable to think a doctor, certainly a quality physician like Dr. Shipman, was in some way harming his patients. If he comes forward and is wrong, it could cost him everything.
Dr. Shipman's patients absolutely adored him. I recall standing in for Dr. Shipman. People who would arrive realised that Dr. Shipman wasn't in the building, that it was a stand-in locum doctor, and would frequently then say, I'd rather wait for Dr. Shipman to come back.
A year passes. 15 more silent and mysterious deaths. What was it that was killing the people of Hyde? The doctors at Brooks Surgery finally agree to meet at a pub in another town to discuss the unusual deaths. Then one doctor, Linda Reynolds, who is now deceased, bravely says what everyone else can barely think.
Dr. Reynolds felt there was something more sinister, and I couldn't bring myself to think that almost. That was the unthinkable.
Dr. Linda Reynolds, who was the first person to really voice the concern that this man was deliberately harming his patients. Now, that's a very bold statement for a doctor to make, that another doctor is deliberately harming his patients.
The consequences are very serious for the doctors if they are wrong. But they must do something. Within days, the head undertaker talks with Dr. Shipman about the high number of patient deaths. But Dr. Shipman is incensed that they would question his skills. He encourages the undertaker and anyone else to review his medical records. In each case, the records reveal health histories that support sudden cardiac arrest. But the doctors are unconvinced. Linda Reynolds had already made the leap that Shipman might be at fault.
And once she'd taken that step, the next step that she made was then to say, I think he's actually killing them. Once the unspoken was spoken, I think we knew that we could no longer just let this rest.
Fingers have already started pointing directly at Dr. Harold Shipman. But are the presumptions accurate? Could there be something the doctors and some of Hyde's residents are missing? It may take a police investigation and several more deaths before they find the real killer. In the 1990s, a rash of unexpected deaths raises suspicions among the residents of the small British town of Hyde. Taxi driver John Shaw has been keeping a list of customers who have died mysteriously. It now numbers more than 20.
I was hearing of deaths every week. The ladies themselves just didn't realise they'd lose a friend, and then another one would lose a friend, and another one. But I was seeing them going every week, one after another. It got to the stage where I couldn't concentrate on my driving. The fact that I was going past houses where ladies had died. I spoke to my wife and I said I must go and speak to someone about this. I must go to the police. I can't stand this any longer. She said, if you're wrong with this, you could get in very serious trouble. Do you realise what you're saying?
Around the same time as the doctors, Shaw also decides to take action. He speaks to an old friend, Detective Stan Egerton.
I said, well, I've got a list of ladies. I said that I feel that Shipman is killed. And Stan's reaction was, bloody hell, John, what are you talking about? How many have you got on this list?
Doctors at Brooks Surgery have also become suspicious and meet to discuss their evidence. If what they fear is true, they want to have proof before they risk taking their suspicions to police. The doctors start by discussing the disturbing number of cremation forms they have been asked to sign by Dr. Shipman.
I looked, or attempted to look, at our death rates and Dr. Shipman's cremation requests from our practice. I had looked at the statistics to compare death rates. There was a staggering difference. There were effectively almost 3 times as many cremation forms from Dr. Shipman's practice as we had total deaths for the year. His practice list size was 1/3 of ours, so that almost corresponds to a 10-fold difference in number of deaths. And those were only the cremation deaths. There were probably another 30% of deaths either in hospital or who were buried, who we didn't know about.
Before the doctors are completely convinced, they try one more time to find a reasonable explanation for the deaths. Could it be that sicker patients seek his help? Perhaps it is his old-fashioned style of home care.
Shipman had a very strong notion that patients should not have undignified deaths in hospital. If somebody is ill and is going to die, that they should be kept at home in order that they may have a peaceful, dignified death. And again, we felt that that may be another reason why his death rate was far higher than ours.
The doctors still don't think the numbers add up, and they decide to contact the police. For the next several days, the police investigator examines the medical records and death certificates of 19 patients of Harold Shipman. He is looking for some proof the doctor is killing his patients.
2 or 3 weeks later, the same police officer returned and informed Dr. Linda Reynolds that there was absolutely no concerns of any sort from their point of view, that there appeared to be no motives for any killings, if that's what we suspected, and that they really could find no concerns at all and nothing to put on Dr. Shipman. They concluded that we were overreacting, really. They concluded that our concerns were completely unfounded.
The doctors are actually relieved that Shipman has been cleared.
Who wants to be proved right? You do not want to think that a fellow doctor is killing his patients intentionally, and then for someone to say to you, that's absolutely correct.
Following that, we did notice the number of cremation forms coming across had significantly decreased.
But if Dr. Shipman hadn't been killing his patients, then what or who was? Could it really just have been an unusual number of natural deaths? Then, just as quickly as the deaths go away, they return. In February of 1997, Bill Catlow arrives in town from a vacation he's taken with his longtime dance partner, Margaret. The day after they're back, he goes to her home to see her.
Are you there?
The doors was open, and I thought, that's strange. I got to the front door and I saw the vestibule door was open. That's a door into the living room. As I got into the second door, Shipman was there.
Are you there? You must be Bill.
The doctor says Margaret called him complaining of dizziness and nausea. Bill approaches his friend. He thinks he feels a pulse.
I just took hold of her hand. I just at the side of the chair where she sat. I still couldn't believe it.
But she's gone. There is nothing they can do. Dr. Shipman explains to Catlow that Margaret has died from complications of pneumonia.
I couldn't grasp it. Unbelievable.
Dr. Shipman here. I just called for
The washing was on the line outside. The ironing board was in the kitchen and the iron was in the kitchen, ready to do the ironing. So a woman doesn't do that if she's sick. She's getting ready to do work.
Another rapid death, another patient under Dr. Harold Shipman's care. If the doctor was indeed innocent, then something or someone very sinister was lurking in the small town of Hyde and doing a good job of throwing people off the scent of the real killer. In Hyde, England, the high death rate of Dr. Harold Shipman's patients leads a group of doctors and a taxi driver to suspect Shipman might be a killer. But police can find no evidence of wrongdoing, and Shipman has been cleared. Someone or something else must be killing the residents of Hyde. On June 24, 1998, a friend comes to check on community leader Elizabeth Smythe after she misses an important council meeting. Elizabeth is lying on her sofa. She isn't breathing. The friend immediately calls her doctor, Harold Shipman. But it is too late. The woman is dead.
Yes, hello.
Taxi driver John Shaw learns of the latest death from another customer.
She was a very, very lively lady, full of beans, and she became a very good friend. When she died, I was told that Dr. Shipman had visited her the morning of her death.
Even though police can't find anything wrong with Dr. Shipman's practices, John Shaw still won't let him off the hook.
I could only come to the one conclusion, that Shipman was killing these ladies.
Finally, a week later, there is a major break in the case. Elizabeth Smythe's daughter goes to the police with what she believes is a forged will she's just received.
Her daughter was contacted by a local solicitor who said that he was in possession of a will purporting to leave all her wealth to Dr. Shipman.
Do you recognise these signatures here?
Elizabeth's daughter doesn't believe it. She herself is a lawyer and had prepared her mother's will years earlier.
You don't recognise these signatures at all?
I first suspected foul play as a result of seeing the documentation. And the documentation, I mean, is the will. The will is a very, very poor forgery. It's poorly put together.
The crudely typed will ignores Elizabeth's beloved family, leaving everything, inexplicably, to Shipman. A new set of investigators launches a second investigation into the doctor. Although Shipman had suggested cremation, Smythe's family chose a burial. Police began by exhuming the body.
There was certainly an eerie feeling about what was taking place. It's very uncomfortable to be present when a body's exhumed.
But they need answers. Was it really a heart attack? Or was it murder? Pathologist John Rutherford performs the autopsy. He finds no evidence of a heart attack.
She was very fit and had no clear anatomical cause for death, so we had to look for other causes.
He takes tissue samples and sends them for toxicology tests. While they await the results, police search Shipman's home.
We were looking for several things. We were looking for the typewriter, which had been used to complete the will, any pens that might match up with the pens that had been used to sign the will. We were looking for blank will forms, in case any of those were stored at his home or at his surgery.
They discover diamorphine, a drug Shipman is not licensed to store.
Diamorphine is a much stronger form of morphine. The street name for diamorphine is heroin.
Used in Britain for pain management, too much diamorphine can kill. Police also search Shipman's surgery and confiscate his medical files. It is there that they make their most important find: a typewriter. If it's the same typewriter used to create the will, this major piece of evidence would undoubtedly prove Harold Shipman's guilt.
He actually offered that up to us when we went to the surgery, saying, I think this is what you're looking for. Later tests revealed that that typewriter was actually used to compile the will.
But falsifying paperwork didn't end there for Dr. Shipman. Police also uncover proof he used his own patients' histories to cover his murderous trail.
Individuals' medical records had actually been made months, if not years, later than they purported to have been made.
He used them to divert any suspicion from his patients' sudden and mysterious deaths.
They'd provided a false history of a particular condition, such as a heart condition, which Shipman had created in an effort to support his contention that an individual had died from a heart-related disease.
On the will is more damning evidence.
What we were able to discover was that Dr. Shipman's fingerprint was actually found in the bottom corner of the will. Significantly, there were no fingerprints on the will, which had been left by her.
At last, police find motive. But how did Dr. Shipman methodically kill his patients? The toxicology results show high levels of diamorphine, which stays in the body tissues indefinitely. The coroner estimates the amount present means she would have died within 3 hours of receiving the drug. There's only one way that could have happened. Elizabeth Smythe was poisoned. And who was the last person to see her under the guise of helping her?
In attempting to explain the high levels of diamorphine which had resulted in her death, Shipman produced her medical records. On those medical records were entries made by him which tended to suggest that she was an abuser of heroin. A bizarre suggestion given her age and her social standing.
Shipman denies everything. But on September 7th, 1998, Manchester police arrest him for the murder of Elizabeth Smythe. But police have no idea how broad the case will become. When word of the arrest spreads, people come forward with more suspected murders.
Once they heard the story of another death, which was published in a newspaper, they would realise it was similar to the circumstances of their relative's death, and in actual fact they would ring the police to report that to them.
The number of possible cases grows at an alarming rate.
Within 2 weeks we were investigating 24 deaths, and by the time the middle of August came round, we were actually investigating 60 deaths.
What had kept people from coming forward for so long?
Many of the people interviewed, it turned out, had harboured concerns about the death of their relative, going back for years. Many weren't actually prepared to voice it because they thought they were in isolation.
They were unwilling to question a respected doctor, and Shipman used his position to gain easy access to his victims. Evidence collected suggested how Shipman chose his targets coldly and randomly. When they thought they were being given medicine, he injected lethal doses of diamorphine.
People put their total trust in their doctor. Any person would just hold their arm out for that injection, wouldn't they? They wouldn't say, "Excuse me, what is that injection for?" They'd just hold their arm out, as my mum would have done.
Police seek proof, with those not cremated. It means nearly a dozen exhumations.
Many a time as I stood there in the mornings, very cold mornings, when it was a kind of a cold that went through your bones, it crossed my mind, you know, he should be here and realise the awful thing he has done. Maybe it would bring him to his senses.
The Reverend hopes Shipman will confess, but he never does. Police investigate a staggering number of deaths, over 500. It is more than anyone imagined. To determine which ones might be murders, they review each patient's records. They find the same story over and over. For police, it is a final and strangely curious clue.
People usually die alone or in the company of relatives, but not in the presence of the general practitioner, as a rule. But Dr. Shipman was frequently there.
The dead were usually found looking peaceful.
As a pathologist, I know that people don't usually die like that. They're found dead on the stairs, on the bedroom floor, just outside the front door, all sorts of places, but very rarely sitting peacefully in an armchair, as many of Shipman's cases were.
In the end, a government report attributes a staggering 345 possible murders to Harold Shipman. He is the most prolific serial killer in the United Kingdom. But prosecutors try him on only 15 deaths. On January 31st, 2000, Harold Shipman is convicted on all counts and sentenced to 15 consecutive life sentences. The question remains, how could it have gone on for so long?
The notion of a doctor killing his or her patients was just unthinkable. It was unthinkable to us as fellow doctors. It was unthinkable by the police. It was unthinkable by the people who live in this town. And I honestly believe that was the main reason why Shipman evaded detection for so long, because it didn't seem possible.
That sense of respect is very powerful.
Even up to the trial and the conviction of Shipman, many people in Hyde still believed him to be innocent, still thought it was a conspiracy, that it was a setup, and that Shipman was innocent. I imagine that there are still odd ones in Hyde who still believe that Shipman was innocent.
But John Shaw did have the courage to go to his friend, Detective Stan Egerton.
When I spoke to Stan, I also said to him, I feel really riddled with guilt. I feel that I should have spoken up sooner.
His friend says if the doctors hadn't also complained, it might have been different.
Stan's reaction was, I would have had you down as a nutter, someone with a grudge against him. I think it should have been picked up a lot sooner than it was.
Angry townspeople agree.
I think the families of some of Shipman's victims are understandably frustrated and upset about the fact that the earlier investigation did not trap Shipman. However, there is an examination taking place of the circumstances of that earlier investigation.
Investigators have searched for a reason to explain the murders. Reverend Dennis Maher believes Shipman simply did it for the thrill.
He enjoyed seeing somebody dying because he was always with the person when they died. He was in leave, contact the family, come back again, and be there more or less when the family came. So he enjoyed the whole process.
Harold Shipman swore to uphold the Hippocratic Oath, which promises, first, do no harm. But Shipman broke that code. On January 13th, 2004, Harold Shipman was found dead in the jail cell he'd been confined to for 4 years. He'd hung himself with his bedsheets. News of his death triggered a torrent of emotions from the community he'd so profoundly harmed. Those feelings were expressed in a single angry word, found scrawled across his former surgery.
He's left a scar on this community that'll probably never go away.